This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Dr. Vincenzo Bollettino, or Enzo, is the director of the Resilient Communities program at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. Prior to his current appointment, he served for 5 years as its executive director. Enzo has 20 years of professional and academic experience in international politics, humanitarian action, civil-military engagement in emergencies, and the security of humanitarian aid workers. He has spent the past 14 years of his career at Harvard University in administration, teaching, and research, where his current research focuses on civil-military engagement during humanitarian emergencies, the security of humanitarian aid workers, and on the professionalization of the humanitarian aid field. I spoke with Enzo in Cambridge. Hello, Enzo. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Stephen, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We are having this conversation in late June. I guess it's late June now. Where are you sitting today? What's it like up there?
I'm sitting here in my office at 14 Story Street at Harvard Humanitarian Initiative in Cambridge. It's a bit overcast today, but otherwise a nice warm and beautiful summer day.
Perfect day for an interview. So, Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, it's a great intro. That's where you work now. That's where you've been for, it looks like about a decade. Tell us about what you do there now, and just give us an introduction to what the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative is.
So I've worked in the Harvard community for about a dozen years now, starting with a postdoc. But I've been at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative since, 2008, so about 7 years. I spent the first 6 years here as the executive director, where I was responsible for management, administration of the initiative. The initiative itself is focused on research in education in the humanitarian field. So we have a variety of different research projects that are led by different faculty members, focusing on things like gender-based violence, humanitarian technology and use of technology in the field, vulnerable populations, implementation science, and a program that looks at the fusion of technology with imagery for providing early warning and for providing tools for the humanitarian field. We also have, through our Humanitarian Academy, a variety of different courses focused both on students here at the School of Public Health, but also on professionals in the humanitarian field. I now, in the past 5 months, have transitioned into a research position, so I'm leading a program on resilient communities, and am undertaking a project in the Philippines over the next 3 years looking at disaster resilience. And I also do research around civil military engagement in response to natural disasters, and have focused both on the response to Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines and more recently to the earthquake in Nepal.
As with most of our guests, you've just laid such a banquet of potential questions on the table here. Let's start where you ended up. You're now kicking off this research in the Philippines. What's the genesis of that? How does that get commissioned? Did you create a proposal and then that's funded, or do you have an endowment that kicks it off, or was this requested by a donor, or how does it work?
So there are really two pieces to the work that I was doing. So the first one that was focused around the response to Typhoon Haiyan, that focused on civil military engagement, how international militaries coordinated their activities with humanitarian agencies and as part of the response. That work was commissioned by the Center for Excellence in Disaster Management and Humanitarian Assistance, which is based out of Hawaii. And I was asked to join a team to do an assessment. Based on that work, I developed my own research project focused on civil engagement that wasn't looking at as much at the policy as it was as on people's perceptions, humanitarian aid workers' perceptions specifically, on how that civil military engagement worked. So I actually just published a paper on that based on the data from that study. So that's one element of it. The second element of it, which is this 3-year-long project on resilience, was funded by a private foundation based on a proposal that was developed over time. We went back and forth with the foundation based on sort of their own sets of interests around supporting the development of resilient communities and greater resilience within the state to better prepare for natural disasters. So basically that process was one of back and forth around a concept note, acceptance of that concept note, and then funding of a 3-year project, which is now started and will begin with the scoping study sometime here in either August or September. I'll be going to the Philippines.
And are you responsible for that proposal, for the putting it together, or do you have a team of people that help you do that? Or how big's the research team that you usually work with?
Virtually every proposal that we develop is the product of a team effort. So there may be a lead person that writes up the proposal. Sometimes it's several people, but invariably there's lots of input. So in the case of this Philippines proposal, there were at least a half a dozen people who participated in its development, and there are different aspects to the project that will be led by different people. So in this specific one, we'll have a fellows program. So there will be professionals from the Philippines that we will search for and hire as fellows that will represent the project in the Philippines to help us basically better connect to institutions, state institutions, and local level community-based organizations, and who will undertake and help with the research in the field as well. We will make links with academic institutions in the Philippines, and then we will have a whole research team here that will consist of 2 PIs, myself and co-PI, Patrick Vink, who's another faculty member here at HHI. We'll have a research coordinator and a postdoc and administrative help as well. So it's a whole team that will be responsible for the project.
What may be an awkward question, but do you think that you win more proposals than most because you're connected to the Harvard brand?
I think it's both opportunity and a challenge, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So it's an opportunity, yes, because the Harvard brand, the Harvard name, connotes a lot of prestige and quality, and people are very interested typically in knowing the opinion or wanting insights from folks at Harvard. I think that is certainly true. I've certainly come across that anecdotally myself in my tenure here. But it's also a challenge in that people assume that because you're at the university with the largest endowment of all universities within the United States, that somehow, you've got a lot of money, when in fact, a center like ours actually doesn't receive funding from Harvard. We raise all of our own funding. So it can be
definitely a two-edged sword there.
Yeah, definitely, for sure.
So
yeah,
I imagine
you have far more resources than you might.
Sure, I imagine you get a lot of donors or foundations coming to you and say, "Hey, what kind of cost share can you bring to this?" Or
yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Wow. I want to go back real quick to the research you were talking about, civil military engagement that you just published on. What's the perception that you've found right now? And the reason it perked my ears is I'm lucky enough to be a veteran of the Iraq Initiative, and when we were there in 2005, 2006, and beyond, that was one of the biggest issues that people put on the table, that the military was doing humanitarian work and they were getting in the way of humanitarian assistance, et cetera. And I'm wondering, what have you found? How has it evolved over the last 10 years? What's the conversation look like now?
So that's a great question. The focus that I've had, and I've done this purposefully, is to look at natural disasters because it's a much easier case than conflict. So clearly in situations like you were involved in Iraq, certainly in Afghanistan and other areas that are in a situation of conflict, it's going to be much more difficult for there to be any collaboration or even serious cooperation between militaries, particularly if the military is party to the conflict, and humanitarian agencies for obvious reasons. So I've selected to begin by looking at natural disasters as an easier case to begin exploring exactly what some of the other challenges are, in the hopes that we can learn some lessons about what good practice looks like in terms of coordination between humanitarian agencies and militaries, and what we can learn about their engagement and interaction as a way of providing a stronger evidence base for what things work well and what things don't work so well.
I was going to say, anything you can put on the table now for our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned that I just wrote an article that will be coming out on the response to Haiyan, and one of the key findings is that there's actually very little knowledge on both sides, both on the military side as well as amongst humanitarian organizations, of some of the standards and guidelines that are out there for actual engagement. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of increased training and better dissemination of some of the guidelines on how militaries are supposed to coordinate with humanitarian agencies in response, in relief. That was one of the major findings. Some of the other things are basically that, you sort of typical perceptions that you might imagine, including that, militaries will often perceive UN agencies or international non-governmental organizations as being very diffuse, multi-purpose, multitasked, not necessarily as well organized and capable as militaries are in moving efficiently and decisively. Similarly, you'll have some perceptions on the humanitarian side that militaries may not be sensitive to populations' perceptions of direct delivery of aid by foreign forces. So those are sort of the typical anecdotal perceptions that are there, and they sort of played out as well in the data in the study as well. But those things were somehow less interesting than the fact that there's actual dearth of knowledge of good practice and good guidelines, which really points to the need for more education, better training, better dissemination of the existing guidelines that are out there, more conversation between militaries and humanitarian agencies on past practice and current doctrine, development of current doctrine going forward.
Why do you think there is a dearth of knowledge? Just out of curiosity, because disasters have been going on for quite a long time now, obviously, and the military has been helping to respond for as long, and yet no one's put together the best practices. There's not the manual somewhere. There's not a central place where people can look. Do you have a sense of why that is?
Well, that's the whole thing. There are guidelines. The Oslo guidelines on use of civil and military defense assets they're there. They've been developed. The United Nations organization, the OCHA, which is the Office for the Coordinator of Humanitarian Affairs, provides trainings all over the globe on civil military engagement, and is purveyor of those Oslo guidelines and disseminates those guidelines. But for some reason, and I don't know the reason, we could speculate on some of the reasons, but those guidelines are not well known, either by militaries or humanitarian agencies. So there definitely needs to be greater effort in figuring out why people aren't aware of them. So, and that's one of the reasons that I'm involved in this kind of research, and others I think will be interested in research, is to figure out how we can better disseminate those guidelines, train to those guidelines, and make sure that there's actual knowledge of the existing practices that are out there. So there's two elements to this. One is there are guidelines, there is some research out there. People need to be better informed about what those are, and we have to find ways to better disseminate and better train to them. And then the second piece of it is that additional research really does need to be done in this field, because there are too many anecdotal pieces, too many policy pieces, and not enough good empirical evidence about what works, what doesn't in civil engagement.
I bet we could talk for the next 2 hours about this. And unfortunately, I want to take it in a different direction right now. And you've given me a bit of a lead in. You're at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative now. You've been doing research there. You've been working with Harvard for quite a while. Did you wake up when you were a young man and say, you know what, I know this is what I want to do. I'm going to go, research humanitarian initiatives? Or was there another path to get you to where you are today? And basically the question is, how did you get to where you are now?
So I was always interested since high school in my high school overlooked, it was in New Jersey, and you could see the New York skyline from it. So I was always interested in New York and in international things, and I was fascinated particularly by the United Nations and the concept of the United Nations. And I didn't know that I was going to pursue this path initially. I actually thought I would go, at that age, that I would go into medicine because I was good at hard sciences and math. But when I got into college and took my first political science course and looked at some of the challenges around conflict and around providing aid to people that were affected by conflict, I became academically interested in it and just interested in the subject. And then I was very fortunate to do an internship at UNICEF in 1996 and worked for the security coordinator there at that time. And I was hooked immediately. When I did that internship, there was no going back. I absolutely loved being at UNICEF. I loved the culture. I loved the organization.
Give us a reminder as well. Do you remember what was going on in '96? Was there a particular crisis or a particular initiative that you were working on that hooked you, or was it just the culture itself?
Well, we had, the world had just witnessed 2 years prior the genocide in Rwanda. There was conflict, of course, in the Balkans as well. And there was an explosion in the number of humanitarian responses following, the end of the Cold War. So very late 80s, early 90s, there was just a huge increase in the amount and the number of humanitarian agencies, both UN and international non-governmental organizations, responding to humanitarian need all over the world. We had emerged out of the logic of the Cold War, where there was some humanitarian activity, but nothing like what we saw in the early 90s. And we haven't turned back since then. It's been increasing number of aid agencies, an increasing effort to better organize and better coordinate those agencies. All kinds of efforts happening globally, both at the community level by community-based organizations around the globe. And now we're seeing so many new technologies that are really changing the face of humanitarian response, humanitarian assistance, really at every level, both within communities that are utilizing technologies to better respond themselves. And it's always the local communities that are the first responders in any kind of disaster. Increased use of technologies by UN agencies, by NGOs for improving their own work, improving data collection, improving analysis, and utilization of technologies for holding agencies accountable. Basically, people on the ground that are able to now very publicly and very quickly offer their opinion, insights, and evidence and photos of exactly what's happening on the ground. Mm-hmm. So technology is really transforming assistance, but ever since the 90s, there's been just a huge increase in activity in the humanitarian sphere, and it's only becoming more complex, more interesting, and really underscores the need for increased professionalization, education, research, evidence of how we are doing as a community, and what impact we're really having on improving people's lives.
So you're a young man from New Jersey. You find yourself at UNICEF. And was this before or after you did your master's degree in Denver?
So I had finished the master's.
Okay, because the reason I ask is quite a few people often approach me. They've done their bachelor's degree, they've got a couple years of experience, or they've done the Peace Corps, and they say, Stephen, where should I go for my master's degree? My advice is almost always, go to the belly of the beast. Go to DC if you can. Go to London or go to some other place where there is a focal point of, this work. But you chose Denver. Tell us about that.
So in my case, honestly, I was accepted directly into a PhD program with my bachelor's degree. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't have done what I did in retrospect. I mean, I've loved everything I've done, but I think it really does make a big difference if you get some professional experience before going for a PhD, just because it makes a huge difference if you know exactly what kind of research question you're interested in and exactly what the different programs offer methodologically in terms of how you would explore that problem. So I think at a very young age and without professional experience, it's difficult to know exactly what the important questions are that you'd like to consider. Now, having said that, if you're going to be going for a master's degree, again, I still think it's not quite the same problem as going for a PhD, but I think it does make a big difference if you are able to do an internship or do something that will give you a sense of what how the program that you're interested in applying for is tailored to address the kinds of questions that you're interested in. So it's good to have some interest, some set of questions in your mind that you are interested in addressing, and then picking the program and the set of methods and the faculty that are involved in answering those types of questions. I think that's sort of a better way of approaching it than thinking about just, the overall reputation of the school or the particular place that you're in. Now, of course, having said that, if you're doing a master's degree in DC, you're right there in a location where there are so many incredible organizations involved in development, humanitarian assistance, et cetera, that it's very likely that you're able to couple a master's degree program also with really practical experience through internships and the like while you're doing your master's.
Sure, and I guess it's the same two-edged sword that you find sitting at Harvard right now, where there is immense more opportunity, but also the competition for that opportunity is also extremely increased as well.
Right.
So sure. You finished your PhD, and what was it like trying to get into Harvard? Was it intense competition? Did you happen upon a research topic that everybody said, "Whoa, we need this guy," or how'd that work?
To be honest, and I don't know to what extent this reflects other people's experiences, but from the very time that I took the internship at UNICEF in '96, everything that I've done has been linked to what I had done previously. So it's like this long chain of opportunities. So at the time that in 1996, I was working for the security coordinator, and there was also a director of logistics who I worked with. That director of logistics then went to the Center for Excellence in Disaster Management and Humanitarian Assistance in Hawaii and gave me a call while he was there, while I was finishing up my PhD exams, but before I had done the dissertation, and asked if I would be interested in coming out. And having just finished the exams and facing the dissertation and being offered a chance to go to Hawaii.
I was just going to say, how many people get that call? Gee.
Exactly. So, and it was in a great organization led by a fantastic director by the name of Skip Burkle, who's a prolific writer and researcher on humanitarian assistance, and who was the founder and first director of the Center for Excellence. So I was there for 2 years, and then other folks that I worked with there were linked with Harvard, both teaching and doing research in a program at Harvard, and again asked if I would be interested in coming out to Harvard to do a postdoc, which I clearly was. So I was encouraged to go finish my dissertation, so I went back to Denver after a couple of years in Hawaii, completed the dissertation, applied for the postdoc, and was accepted. Did that for 2 years, and that was focused on looking at the security of humanitarian aid workers. And then, once I was here, I started teaching at the extension school, which I did for several years, and have made my way through organizations focused on humanitarian assistance in one aspect or another.
Looking back, or where you're sitting today, obviously research is where your focus is, at least for the foreseeable future. Is there any tension for you between field work, practitioner work, teaching, and research? Do you always get to do a combination of the three, or do you sometimes feel yourself saying, I wish I could do more of one of them?
There's always a tension, and I've always felt really compelled to not do just one of those things. I was really glad for the opportunity to be the executive director here because it gave me management and administrative experience that I never would have had otherwise, which is such a different experience than research, which again is different from teaching. So I've always been very interested in actual policy and operations on the ground that aid agencies are involved in, and that entire community. But I've also always wanted to have an understanding of the aid community's impact, how it operates, and so there's no way that you can do that, I think, as when you're steeped in it and strictly involved in operations. You need to be either at a think tank or an academic institution, or you have the space, the methodological tools, and the time to examine those sorts of missions and better understand what they mean, how they operate, what impact they have. So I've always really been drawn to both sides, and so have loved, either through internships or consultancies that I've done with the UN agencies and NGOs. I've always loved that aspect of it, but I've been even more strongly drawn to the academic side of it, and so have sort of settled on the academic side. But again, it's not, even on the academic side, I haven't strictly researched and taught. I've also done management and administration through the executive director role here. So I guess, my approach has always been one of exploring different avenues. And then as long as I find it interesting, challenging, compelling, and somehow contributing and making some sort of difference, then I've been willing to take that path.
And then there's a second tension there with your research, right? That unfortunately, as researchers, we find that there's lots and lots of topics that interest us. You're focused right now on civil maritime affairs and post-disaster issues. Is there another topic or another couple of topics that you think are just super, super interesting and things that are going to change the aid world and the aid community over the next 3 or 5 years? I
do. So I'm now leading this program on resilient communities, and I actually do think there's going to be a big move away in the humanitarian sector from massive international humanitarian response to disasters, greater focus and greater effort to capacitate, facilitate, and otherwise support more remotely local initiatives. I think the wave of the future will be community-based organizations, other civil society actors, and the state of the local affected state, which in any case has always been the first responders, but now with a whole range of new technologies and emerging capacity within civil society-based organizations as a result, I think the humanitarian sector will be more focused on training, on education, on providing funding and know-how to organizations that are local. That will be the principal operational actors, I think, on the ground. So you've seen this, we've seen this through the most recent administrator at USAID, his push to have, 30% of funds be locally driven or be given directly to local organizations. Have you seen other evidence of this where the capacity in other countries outside of the quote-unquote, Western world, it's there now? Or it's strong enough that it can be used relatively securely to respond to disaster and crisis? I think increasingly so, yes. I mean, both in the Philippines, which is a country prone to multiple different kinds of disasters on a regular basis, there's a really strong set of institutional mechanisms there, both at the national level, but as well as at a variety of different municipal levels and even further down at the community level, at the barangay level. I certainly saw that in Nepal immediately after the earthquake. I had been there looking specifically at civil-military engagement, but I was fortunate enough to meet with Kathmandu Living Labs, which is a local Kathmandu-based organization focused on a variety of different resilience projects. They played a phenomenal role in the response. They stood up their operations to provide crowdsourced information through a product called Quake Map, where they were utilizing a variety of different technologies to crowdsource information about what was happening on the ground across the affected areas. They were able to take that information, map it, analyze it, verify the information, analyze it, and get actionable information directly to the Nepalese military and other ministries within the government. And this was a small organization, but they were able to get something like over 4,300 volunteers that were working internationally all over the world to provide information into their system. They got a lot of local volunteers and stood up their own staff so that they even took over, for example, a cafe that was adjoining their offices, were working out in the garden there and played a tremendous role in providing verified crowdsourced information to their government and military that was providing direct assistance on the ground.
Just a couple more questions here. One that I like to ask a lot is, if you and I were to go sit down and have a beer or a cup of coffee somewhere, throughout all the research that you've done or the teaching or the field work that you've done, what's your go-to story? What's the story about, hey, this is an amazing finding that would just blew me away, or I was in the field one time and this happened. What's that go-to story for you?
I think the thing that really drove me, it wasn't based on any one particular field experience, and those have been so varied. They're very different from one another. They're in some ways hard to compare. But the one thing that was very compelling for me was when, as an intern at UNICEF, we were asked by the director at the time of the organization to identify threats to UNICEF staff in the field. We really couldn't do it effectively because they're just data wasn't collected. And that sort of led me down the path of wanting to improve the way operations were undertaken by improving the evidence base. So that is systematically collecting data and providing really strong empirical evidence about exactly what things were threatening UN and international NGO staff in the field. So that was a particular avenue that I pursued. And subsequent to that, there have been a number of great organizations that have emerged to systematically collect that kind of data and analyze it. But we've seen a huge, I think, increase in the importance of good science and the role good science is playing in providing an evidence base for how the international humanitarian community operates, works, its effectiveness, what is working, what isn't, in a whole variety of different sectors. So this move towards improving the evidence base and improving the role of research and education in humanitarian assistance to better further professionalize the field, I think is extremely important and something that was very compelling to me. So I go all the way back to 1996 when we couldn't answer a question because we were lacking the data. That was the compelling moment for me to sort of pursue the academic side of things and try to help to move the entire field forward by emphasizing the important role that research and education play in humanitarian assistance.
Again, a nice, beautiful segue into the last question I have. It's the same question I asked every guest here on the podcast. You occupy one of the seats that is less than sexy to most people, right? Other than that you work for the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, you're not a field worker. You're not the person in the field digging the well or responding to the disaster or giving the child the vaccination. But nonetheless, it's an extremely important position because you're providing the data, the research, the evidence to move these initiatives forward. What advice would you give to someone who is either completing a master's degree right now or interested in transitioning into humanitarian aid from a different sector? What's your one or two pieces of critical advice about how to create a career that's both sustainable and satisfying?
It's a great question, and I actually spend a good part of my time talking to people that are interested in pursuing careers in the humanitarian field. Probably have a dozen conversations a week with folks. So over the past 6 years, I've had literally thousands of conversations and have tried to help connect people with organizations, with opportunities, and basically have provided advice and feedback on sort of paths people have wanted to take in this field, which has actually been an incredible experience for me as well, because it's given me an opportunity to really appreciate how many different interests people have, how varied they are, the different skill sets and the unique contributions that people can really bring to this field. There's no one path. I think increasingly this field is becoming more professionalized, and there are specific kinds of training and specific academic programs that can be taken that will give prospective candidates for either going into the field through an academic path, or people that are wanting to work directly in a UN agency or an NGO or community-based organization working on humanitarian assistance or development. There isn't a singular path. So there's no substitute at the end of the day for pursuing something that is of directly important, directly meaningful to the person who's pursuing it. You have to be passionate about what you're doing, I think, to do well at it. And then B, just basic sets of skills if you're going to work sort of in an operational organization, are important. So if you are learning about and are interested in water sanitation, identifying the skill sets that will help with that is important. If you're interested in looking at impact, taking monitoring and evaluation courses. If you're interested in food delivery, understanding nutrition and taking those sorts of courses or getting those sorts of experiences. There's no one nice thing about this field is that there are so many ways to enter it. There really isn't a specific path to doing it. One thing I would offer is that it's really important to be extremely persistent and not to give up trying to get into this field. It can seem daunting because, in fact, there isn't one path or one agency or one way to do it. But speak to people who are in the field, speak to people that are working in a variety of different organizations and from different perspectives, figure out what it is that drives and compels you, and then identify the sorts of skills that would be important for your pursuing or succeeding in that area, and start putting those things together. It will be a variety of both practical experience from working in different organizations, as well as some academic training as well.
Enzo, thank you so very much for being a guest on our show today.
It's been my distinct pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.